The storm wasn't supposed to be there. Weather satellites had missed it, radar couldn't penetrate it, and now a wall of electrical fury stretched across the horizon like nature's own defense system. Behind that wall, 12 American hostages waited in a compound that would be unreachable in 6 hours when diplomatic immunity expired. Every conventional aircraft had been grounded. Every pilot had been told it was impossible. Everyone except Captain Sarah Mitchell. They'd called her deadweight for 3 years. A relic from the old guard who couldn't adapt to modern warfare. But when the brass needed someone to thread a stealth bomber through lightning that could fry every electronic system on board, they weren't laughing anymore. This is the story of how one woman's quiet determination turned impossible into inevitable. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Briefing room at Whiteman Air Force Base hummed with the low murmur of urgent conversation. Digital displays cast blue light across the faces of America's elite bomber crews, each screen showing satellite imagery of the storm system that had materialized over Eastern Europe like a meteorological nightmare. Lightning struck every 12 seconds in perfect intervals, creating an electromagnetic field so intense it had already downed 2 reconnaissance drones. Captain Sarah Mitchell sat in the back row, her flight suit pressed but bearing the subtle signs of someone who maintained her own gear. No creases from a base laundry service, no insignia that gleamed with recent polishing. Her name tag was slightly faded, and her boots, while regulation, showed the kind of careful maintenance that spoke of someone who understood that details mattered even when no one was watching. The mission commander, Colonel James Harrison, stood at the front of the room with the bearing of a man accustomed to having his words carry weight. His voice cut through the ambient noise as he gestured toward the largest display. The target is a fortified compound approximately 40 miles beyond the storm front. 12 American civilian contractors captured during the embassy evacuation. Intelligence confirms they're alive, but we have a narrow window. The host government's ceasefire agreement expires at 0600 local time. After that, those people become expendable. A pilot in the third row, Major Kevin Rodriguez, leaned forward. "Sir, what about the weather? Those electromagnetic pulses are registering off the charts. Any aircraft that enters that storm is going to lose navigation, communications, probably flight control systems." Harrison's jaw tightened. "That's the problem, Major. Our B-2 Spirit bombers are our most advanced aircraft, but they're also the most dependent on electronic systems. The storm isn't just weather, it's a complete denial of our technological advantage." From the side of the room, Lieutenant Colonel Amanda Foster, the wing's operations officer, consulted her tablet. "We've run simulations on every possible approach vector. The storm front extends from ground level to 60,000 feet. No gaps, no windows. It's a complete electronic dead zone." "What about going around?" asked Captain David Chun, one of the younger pilots. "Extended range refueling over the Atlantic? Time," Harrison replied curtly. "By the time we circumnavigate that weather system, those hostages will be dead. We need someone who can go through it, not around it." The room fell silent except for the hum of ventilation systems and the distant sound of aircraft engines warming up on the tarmac. Every pilot in the room had trained for impossible missions, but this was beyond impossible. This was suicide with extra steps. Sarah shifted slightly in her seat, her eyes fixed on the weather display. While the others saw chaos, she saw patterns. The lightning strikes weren't random, they followed atmospheric pressure differentials. The electromagnetic pulses had rhythm, like a heartbeat. She'd seen similar patterns over the Hindu Kush Mountains during her deployment in Afghanistan, though nothing quite this intense. To the Major, Patricia Williams, seated 2 rows ahead, turned to whisper to her wingman. "Looks like this mission's going to be a scrub. No way to fly through that storm with modern avionics." Could always try it old school, her wingman replied with a sardonic grin. Dead reckoning, manual flight controls. Like the old days. Right, Williams snorted. And who exactly is going to volunteer for that death wish? Sarah's hand moved, almost imperceptibly, to the notebook she kept in her thigh pocket. Inside were pages of handwritten calculations, atmospheric pressure charts, and electromagnetic field studies she'd compiled during her off-duty hours. While other pilots spent their free time in the officers' club or updating their social media profiles, Sarah studied weather patterns. She'd always been fascinated by the intersection of meteorology and aviation, a fascination that had earned her more than a few dismissive comments from her peers. Asterisk. Dead weight. She'd heard Major Thompson call her just last week. Still fighting the last war while the rest of us are preparing for the next one. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same old-school skills they mocked might be the only thing that could save those hostages. Colonel Harrison continued his briefing. But Sarah could see the defeat creeping into his posture. The mission was already being written off as impossible. Plans were being made for diplomatic solutions, prisoner exchanges, political negotiations, all the things that happened when military options were exhausted. The president has been briefed, Harrison said. State Department is exploring alternative channels. But make no mistake, those people are counting on us. If there's a way to get them out, we need to find it. Captain Lisa Park, one of the most experienced B-2 pilots in the wing, raised her hand. Sir, has anyone considered using the older aircraft? The B-52s might be less vulnerable to electromagnetic interference. Too slow, Foster replied, and too detectable. The moment they cross into hostile airspace, they'll be lit up by surface-to-air missiles. We need stealth capability, which means we need the B-2, but the B-2 can't function without its electronic systems, Rodriguez pointed out. The fly-by-wire controls, the navigation computers, the stealth coding management, all of it depends on electronics that Storm will fry. Harrison nodded grimly. Which brings us back to the fundamental problem. We need the B-2's stealth capabilities, but we can't use them in that electromagnetic environment. Sarah's pen moved across her notebook, sketching the storm system's electrical patterns. She'd been studying electromagnetic warfare countermeasures for years, not because it was part of her assigned duties, but because she found it intellectually fascinating. Most pilots focused on the sexy aspects of flying speed, maneuverability, weapon systems. Sarah had always been drawn to the subtle challenges, the problems that required patience and precision rather than raw skill. During her time at the Air Force Academy, she'd written her senior thesis on manual flight control systems in electronic warfare environments. Her professors had been impressed, but her classmates had found it boring. Why learn to fly without computers, one had asked, when computers can fly better than we can? The question had always bothered her. Computers could indeed fly better than humans under normal circumstances. But what happened when circumstances stopped being normal? There is one possibility, Harrison said, though his tone suggested he didn't believe it himself. Manual flight control. Disconnecting the fly-by-wire systems and flying the aircraft like the old mechanical bombers. The room erupted in murmurs of disbelief. Major Johnson, a veteran with over 2,000 flight hours, shook his head. Sir, with respect, the B-2 wasn't designed for manual control. The aerodynamics are completely unstable. Without computer assistance, it's unflyable. The manual control systems exist, Foster interjected. Emergency protocols. But you'd need someone with extensive experience in pre-digital aircraft. Someone who understands old-school navigation and can maintain control of an inherently unstable airframe. Sarah's grip tightened on her pen. She'd flown everything from vintage Cessnas to Korean War-era jets during her private pilot training. While her peers had focused on mastering the latest technology, she'd spent weekends at air shows, talking to old-timers who'd learned to fly when instruments were mechanical and navigation was done with maps and compasses. The pilot would also need to understand electromagnetic field theory, Harrison added. How to predict the storm's behavior, find the gaps in the electrical activity. We're not just talking about flying through bad weather, we're talking about threading a needle made of lightning. The room had grown quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. This wasn't the silence of defeat, it was the silence of impossibility being confronted with the faintest possibility of hope. Sarah closed her notebook and stood up. 24 pairs of eyes turned toward her, some curious, others dismissive. She'd been in this position before, the outsider, the one who approached problems differently. Usually her different approach was ignored or politely dismissed. Today, lives hung in the balance. I'd like to volunteer for the mission, sir. The silence that followed was deafening. Major Williams actually laughed, a short, sharp sound that cut through the tension like a blade. Mitchell, Colonel Harrison said carefully, this isn't a training exercise. We're talking about flying a $70 billion aircraft through an electromagnetic storm that could kill you before you even reach the target. I understand the risks, sir. Sarah's voice was steady, carrying none of the bravado that typically accompanied such statements. I also understand the requirements. Manual flight control experience, pre-digital navigation skills, and electromagnetic field theory. I have all three. Captain Rodriguez turned in his seat to face her. Sarah, no offense, but when's the last time you flew a high-priority mission? You've been assigned to training flights and equipment testing for the past 3 years. The words stung because they were true. Sarah had indeed been relegated to the less glamorous assignments, training new pilots, testing modifications to existing aircraft, flying the missions that kept the wing operational, but never made headlines. Her peers saw it as evidence that she wasn't cut out for the important work. Sarah had learned to see it differently. Every flight I've taken has been preparation for this one, she said simply. While you've been learning to trust computers, I've been learning to fly without them. Major Thompson, the same pilot who'd called her dead weight, leaned back in his chair with a smirk. And what makes you think you can do what the rest of us can't? Sarah looked directly at him, her expression calm but determined. Because the rest of you are afraid to turn off the computers. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The silence stretched for exactly 7 seconds, before Major Thompson's laughter broke it. Not a chuckle or a snort, but full-throated amusement that echoed off the briefing room walls. 3 other pilots joined in, their mirth creating a wall of sound that felt designed to shrink Sarah back into her seat. Turn off the computers? Thompson repeated, wiping his eyes. Mitchell, this isn't 1943. We're not flying B-17s over Germany with nothing but a compass and a prayer. The B-2 Spirit is the most sophisticated aircraft ever built. You can't just flip a switch and fly it like a crop duster. Captain Rodriguez shook his head, his expression a mix of pity and disbelief. Sarah, I've seen you fly. You're competent, don't get me wrong, but this isn't about basic piloting skills. We're talking about penetrating hostile airspace in a stealth bomber that costs more than most countries' entire defense budgets. Lieutenant Colonel Foster cleared her throat, her voice carrying the diplomatic tone of someone trying to let someone down easy. Captain Mitchell, your enthusiasm is noted, but this mission requires our most experienced pilot. Someone with proven combat experience in high-stress environments. The words hung in the air like an indictment. Sarah's combat record was sparse. Compared to her peers, a handful of support missions in Afghanistan, mostly reconnaissance and supply runs. While pilots like Rodriguez and Thompson had logged hundreds of hours in active combat zones, Sarah had spent her deployment flying the unglamorous but necessary missions that kept the war machine running. Colonel Harrison stepped forward, his expression carefully neutral. Mitchell, I appreciate your willingness to volunteer, but Lieutenant Colonel Foster raises valid concerns. This isn't a training exercise or an equipment test. We're talking about a precision strike deep in hostile territory with zero room for error. And zero electronic support, Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the growing murmur of dismissive comments from her peers. Sir, with respect, how many pilots in this room have experience flying without GPS, without terrain-following radar, without automated flight controls? Major Williams turned fully around in her seat, her expression skeptical. We all trained on manual backup systems at flight school, Mitchell. That's basic requirement. Flight school simulations, Sarah corrected. Controlled environments with instructors standing by to take over if things go wrong. I'm talking about real flight time in aircraft with mechanical controls. Hours of experience reading weather patterns by eye, navigating by dead reckoning. Feeling how an aircraft responds when you can't rely on computer assistance. Captain Chun, one of the younger pilots, raised his hand tentatively. Not to interrupt, but couldn't we just wait for the storm to pass? How long can it possibly last? Foster consulted her tablet, scrolling through meteorological data. Current. Projections show the storm system intensifying over the next 18 hours. By the time it clears, our window for hostage extraction will be closed. The diplomatic immunity expires at 06:00 local time tomorrow. After that, we're looking at a full-scale international incident. Which brings us back to the fundamental problem, Harrison said, his frustration beginning to show. We need to get through that storm tonight, or those people die. And none of our conventional approaches will work. Sarah opened her notebook and stepped toward the front of the room. Several pilots exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from curious to openly annoyed. She ignored them, focusing on the weather display that dominated the wall. The storm isn't random, she said, pointing to the swirling patterns of electrical activity. Look at the lightning strikes. They're following pressure differentials in the atmosphere. Every 12 seconds, just like Colonel Harrison mentioned. That's not coincidence, that's physics. Thompson rolled his eyes. We all took meteorology, Mitchell. Knowing why lightning strikes doesn't help us fly through it. It does if you understand the patterns, Sarah continued, undeterred. These electrical discharges create brief windows of reduced electromagnetic interference. Gaps in the field where electronic systems might function for short periods. If you time it right, you could potentially use navigation systems for quick position fixes before they fail again. Major Johnson, the veteran pilot, leaned forward with interest despite himself. You're talking about threading the needle between lightning strikes. The timing would have to be perfect. 12-second intervals, Sarah confirmed. Which means you'd have approximately 8 seconds of reduced interference, followed by 4 seconds of complete electrical chaos. Enough time for a position fix, but not enough to rely on automated systems. Foster looked up from her tablet, her expression thoughtful. The theoretical framework is sound, but the practical application. Captain, you're describing a level of precision that borders on impossible. One timing error, one miscalculation, and you'd be flying blind through the most dangerous weather system on record. We're already flying blind, Sarah pointed out. Current mission planning assumes no electronic support whatsoever. At least. This approach offers the possibility of occasional navigation assistance. Captain Rodriguez shook his head firmly. Sarah, even if your theory about the electromagnetic windows is correct, you're still talking about manually flying a B-2 Spirit. The aircraft's aerodynamics are inherently unstable. Without computer-assisted flight controls, most pilots couldn't keep it airborne for 5 minutes, let alone navigate through a storm system. Most pilots couldn't, Sarah agreed. But some could. The challenge in her voice was unmistakable, and the room's energy shifted noticeably. What had started as dismissive amusement was crystallizing into something sharper, More personal. Major Thompson stood up, his 6-foot frame imposing in the fluorescent lighting. You're seriously suggesting that you're the only pilot in this room capable of flying that mission? I'm suggesting that I'm the only pilot in this room who spent the last 3 years preparing for exactly this type of scenario. Sarah replied without backing down. While everyone else has been perfecting their skills with the latest technology, I've been studying what happens when that technology fails. Because you couldn't keep up with modern warfare, Williams interjected, her voice sharp with irritation. Sarah, we've all seen your efficiency reports. You're consistently rated as competent, but not exceptional. Your combat experience is minimal, your technology scores are below average, and you've been assigned to training duties because that's where your skill set fits best. The words hit their mark, and Sarah felt the familiar sting of being dismissed. Categorized, filed away as insufficient. She'd heard variations of this assessment throughout her career: capable but not exceptional, competent but not outstanding, good enough for support roles, but not quite ready for the important missions. Colonel Harrison seemed to sense the tension escalating beyond productive bounds. Let's maintain focus on the mission parameters, he said, his command voice cutting through the personal dynamics. Captain Mitchell, your theoretical framework is interesting, but theory and practice are different things. This mission requires proven capabilities under extreme stress. Sir, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the criticism still echoing in her ears. I've logged over 300 hours in vintage aircraft with mechanical controls. I've studied electromagnetic field theory extensively, and I've developed navigation techniques specifically for electronic warfare environments. My efficiency reports might not reflect combat heroics, but they do reflect preparation. Captain Chun looked genuinely curious now. 300 hours in vintage aircraft? When did you find time for that? Weekends, holidays, personal leave time. Sarah's answer was matter-of-fact, without any hint of self-pity or resentment. While most pilots use their off-duty time for recreation, I used mine for education. Which explains why you don't have any friends, Thompson muttered, loud enough for several people to hear. The comment drew uncomfortable laughter from some quarters and disapproving looks from others. Sarah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but her expression remained composed. Friendship and mission capability are different skill sets, she said quietly. One of them might save those hostages. Lieutenant Colonel Foster closed her tablet with a decisive snap. Captain Mitchell, I appreciate your dedication to alternative flying techniques, but this conversation is becoming unproductive. The mission requirements are clear. We need our most experienced combat pilot flying our most advanced aircraft. Personal preparation, however extensive, doesn't substitute for proven performance under fire. And what happens when proven performance isn't enough? Sarah asked. When experience with normal operations becomes a liability in abnormal conditions. Then we find another solution, Harrison said firmly. We don't risk a multi-billion-dollar aircraft and one of our pilots on untested theories. The dismissal was complete, professional, and utterly final. Sarah closed her notebook, her movements deliberate and controlled. Around her, the briefing continued as if she'd never spoken, the conversation moving on to conventional alternatives and diplomatic backup plans. As she walked toward the exit, Sarah caught fragments of whispered conversations. Always thought she was a little odd, spending weekends at air shows instead of living like a normal person. Good thing Harrison shut that down before she got herself killed. The door closed behind her with a soft pneumatic hiss, and Sarah found herself alone. In the corridor outside the briefing room, the familiar weight of dismissal settled on her shoulders like an old coat, uncomfortable but worn with practice. Behind her, through the closed door, she could hear Colonel Harrison's voice resuming the briefing. Given the constraints we're facing, our best option may be to wait for diplomatic channels to produce results. State Department is confident they can negotiate an extension. Sarah walked away, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. But she wasn't walking toward her quarters or the officers' club. She was walking toward the flight line, where a B-2 Spirit sat in its hardened hangar, waiting for a pilot brave enough to turn off the computers and trust something more fundamental than technology. The mission might be impossible. But impossible, Sarah had learned, was often just another word for untried. Hangar 7 stood at the far end of Whiteman's flight line, separated from the main operations complex by a quarter-mile of tarmac that shimmered with heat distortion even in the evening air. Unlike the bustling activity around the conventional aircraft hangars, this facility maintained an almost cathedral-like silence. Security was tighter here, 2 layers of checkpoint barriers, biometric scanners, and guards who took their jobs seriously enough to make eye contact with everyone who passed. Sarah badged through the outer checkpoint without incident. Her clearance level wasn't questioned. She'd been working on B-2 systems integration for the past 18 months, one of those unglamorous assignments that kept her qualified on the aircraft while keeping her away from the high-visibility missions. The irony wasn't lost on her while her peers flew headlines-worthy sorties. She'd been spending her time learning every mechanical and electronic system on the world's most advanced bomber. The inner hangar doors parted with a whisper of hydraulics, revealing the aircraft that had consumed most of her professional life for the past 3 years. The B-2 Spirit, designated Ghost Rider, sat in the center of the hangar like a technological cathedral, its triangular silhouette both elegant and predatory. Maintenance crews had finished their evening inspection cycle, leaving the aircraft pristine under the harsh LED lighting. At 172 feet from wingtip to wingtip, it dominated the space with a presence that demanded respect. Sarah walked the perimeter slowly, her eyes cataloging details that most pilots never bothered to learn. The stealth coating panels that required precise temperature and humidity control. The flush-mounted sensors that could detect enemy radar while remaining virtually invisible themselves. The weapons bay doors that opened with tolerances measured in millimeters. This wasn't just an aircraft, it was a marvel of engineering that represented decades of technological advancement, and according to conventional wisdom, it was completely unflyable without computer assistance. Working late again, Captain? The voice belonged to Master Sergeant Elena Vasquez, the crew chief responsible for Ghost Rider's maintenance. She emerged from beneath the aircraft's starboard wing, her coveralls stained with hydraulic fluid and her hands carrying the perpetual grease marks of someone who understood machinery at a molecular level. "Evening, Sergeant," Sarah replied. "Just wanted to take another look at the manual control interfaces." Vasquez raised an eyebrow. "Those systems haven't been activated in years. Everything's fly-by-wire now." "The manual controls are basically museum pieces." "Backup systems," Sarah corrected. "Required by regulation, even if they're never used." "Never used because they're not supposed to be used," Vasquez said, walking over to join Sarah beneath the aircraft's nose. "This bird's aerodynamics are completely unstable. Without computer assistance, it's like trying to balance a dinner plate on a broomstick while riding a unicycle. Theoretically possible, but practically suicidal." Sarah nodded, running her hand along the edge of the primary flight control panel. "What if the computers failed completely? System-wide electronic failure? Then you'd eject and hope the parachute worked," Vasquez replied matter-of-factly. "Captain, why the sudden interest in manual controls? You working on some kind of training scenario?" The question hung in the air while Sarah considered how much to reveal. Vasquez had been maintaining military aircraft for 22 years, starting with F-16s and working her way up to the most sophisticated bomber in the world. If anyone would understand the practical challenges of flying without electronic assistance, it would be her. "Hypothetically," Sarah said carefully, "if someone needed to fly this aircraft through an electromagnetic interference environment, Severe interference that would knock out all electronic systems. What would be the primary challenges? Vasquez was quiet for a long moment, studying Sarah's face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a complex mechanical problem. Hypothetically. Well, Vasquez said slowly, the first challenge would be basic flight control. The B-2's design creates constant instability. The computers make thousands of tiny adjustments every second to keep it flying straight. Without that assistance, a pilot would need superhuman reflexes and an intuitive understanding of how the aircraft responds to control inputs. Sarah pulled out her notebook and began writing. What about navigation? Dead reckoning only, compass, airspeed, time calculations. Like flying in the 1940s, except in an aircraft that handles nothing like anything from the 1940s. Vasquez paused, then added, Captain, this is a pretty specific hypothetical scenario. You want to tell me what's really going on? Asterisk before Sarah could answer, her phone buzzed with an incoming text message. She glanced at the screen and felt her stomach tighten. The message was from Lieutenant Colonel Foster. Diplomatic negotiations stalled. State Department requesting 12-hour extension. Host government refused. Mission window closing faster than anticipated. Sergeant, Sarah said, looking up from her phone. How long would it take to configure this aircraft for manual flight control? Vasquez's expression shifted from curious to concerned. Captain, you're talking about disconnecting primary flight control systems on a $70 billion aircraft. That's not something you do on a whim. There are procedures, authorizations, safety protocols. I know the procedures, Sarah said quietly. I'm asking about the technical requirements. Time and complexity. The crew chief was silent for nearly a minute, her experienced eyes studying both Sarah and the aircraft with equal intensity. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of professional expertise earned through decades of hands-on experience. 4 hours, she said finally. Maybe 5 if we run into complications. We'd need to physically disconnect the fly-by-wire interfaces, install mechanical linkages to the control surfaces, and recalibrate the backup instruments. It's doable, but it would essentially turn this into a completely different aircraft. Sarah made notes, her pen moving quickly across the page. What about weapons systems? Manual release only. No computer-guided targeting, no automated sequencing. You'd be dropping bombs the way they did in World War II by eye and timing. And stealth capabilities? That's the real problem, Vasquez admitted. The stealth coding requires constant electronic monitoring and adjustment. Temperature variations, humidity changes, even minor structural flex can affect radar signatures. Without computer management, you'd be flying a very expensive conventional bomber that shows up on enemy radar like a Christmas tree. The implications were sobering. Even if Sarah could somehow master the manual flight controls and navigate by dead reckoning, the aircraft would lose the primary advantage that made the mission possible in the first place. Without stealth capabilities, the bomber would be vulnerable to surface-to-air missiles, fighter aircraft, and every other defensive system the enemy could deploy. There might be a workaround, Vasquez said thoughtfully. The stealth systems have an emergency mode designed for battle damage scenarios. It locks the coding configuration in a preset pattern optimized for the most common radar frequencies. Not perfect, but better than nothing. Sarah looked up from her notebook. How much better? Maybe 60% effectiveness. Good enough to avoid detection at long range, not good enough to fool sophisticated targeting systems up close. Vasquez paused. Captain, I've been working on this aircraft for 8 years. I know every bolt, every wire, every system. What you're describing isn't just difficult, it's borderline impossible. And even if it could be done, the risks. I know the risks, Sarah said softly. Sergeant, can I ask you something? In your 22 years of military service, how many times have you seen impossible become necessary? Vasquez smiled grimly. More times than I care to count. Which is why I'm still here having this conversation instead of telling you to forget whatever crazy idea you're considering. Sarah's phone buzzed again. This time the message was from Colonel Harrison. All conventional options exhausted. State Department confirms diplomatic failure. Hostage execution scheduled for 0600 local time. Pentagon requesting alternative proposals. The two women stood in silence beneath the massive aircraft, both understanding that the hypothetical scenario had just become terrifyingly real. Somewhere beyond the electromagnetic storm, 12 American civilians were counting on solutions that didn't exist, except in the mind of a pilot who had spent 3 years preparing for the impossible. "Sergeant," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to propose, "I need to make a phone call. After that, we might need to work through the night." Vasquez nodded slowly. "I'll start pulling the technical manuals. Just in case." As Sarah walked toward the hangar office to make her call, she could hear Vasquez already moving equipment, the sound of tools being gathered and systems being assessed. The crew chief might not understand the full scope of what was being planned, but she recognized the sound of preparation for something that had never been attempted before. Behind them, Ghost Rider waited in silence, its computers humming with electronic sophistication that would soon be rendered useless. In 12 hours, the aircraft would either make history or become the most expensive failure in military aviation. Sarah dialed Colonel Harrison's direct line, knowing that the conversation ahead would change everything. The dismissal she'd received in the briefing room was about to be replaced by a very different kind of attention. The phone rang once before Harrison answered. In the background, she could hear the urgent murmur of crisis management voices raised. In frustration, the clatter of keyboards, the tension that filled rooms when time was running out and options were disappearing. "Colonel," Sarah said when he picked up, "I'd like to formally request authorization to attempt the mission we discussed in the briefing." The silence that followed lasted exactly 7 seconds, the same duration as the silence that had preceded her dismissal earlier that day. But this time, when Harrison spoke, his voice carried a very different tone. "Captain Mitchell," he said carefully, "are you telling me you believe you can actually fly that mission?" "No, sir," Sarah replied, looking up at the triangular silhouette that dominated the hangar. "I'm telling you I know I can." The emergency conference room at Whiteman's command center had been designed for crisis management, but nothing in its sterile efficiency suggested preparation for a crisis quite like this one. 3 wall-mounted displays showed different aspects of the deteriorating situation: satellite imagery of the intensifying storm system, real-time diplomatic cables from the State Department, and a countdown timer marking the hours until the hostage execution deadline. Sarah stood at attention beside the conference table, her flight suit crisp, despite having spent the previous 4 hours in the hangar with Sergeant Vasquez. Around the table sat the base's senior leadership, their faces bearing the weight of impossible decisions. Colonel Harrison occupied the head of the table, flanked by Lieutenant Colonel Foster and Major General Patricia Reynolds, who had flown in from Strategic Air Command headquarters specifically for this briefing. "Captain Mitchell," General Reynolds began, her voice carrying the measured authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of lives. "Colonel Harrison has briefed me on your proposal. I want to be absolutely clear about what you're suggesting." Sarah kept her eyes focused on a point just above the general's head, maintaining the formal posture that military protocol demanded. "Yes, ma'am. You're proposing to disconnect the primary flight control systems on a B-2 Spirit bomber, fly it manually through an electromagnetic storm that has already destroyed 2 reconnaissance drones, penetrate hostile airspace without functional stealth systems, conduct a precision strike on a fortified compound, and return safely through the same storm system that nearly killed you on the way in, That's correct, ma'am. Reynolds leaned back in her chair, studying Sarah with the intensity of someone trying to solve an equation with too many variables. Captain, I've been flying military aircraft for 28 years. I've commanded bomber wings, planned strategic operations, and authorized missions that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible. What you're describing isn't pushing boundaries, it's ignoring them completely. Lieutenant Colonel Foster consulted her tablet, scrolling through data with the practiced efficiency of a staff officer. General, the technical assessment from maintenance suggests that while the manual flight modifications are theoretically possible, the risks are astronomical. We're talking about a 90% probability of aircraft loss, and that's assuming optimal conditions. Asterisk, which we don't have, added Colonel Harrison. The storm system is continuing to intensify. Lightning frequency has increased to every 8 seconds, and the electromagnetic field strength is beyond anything our aircraft are designed to handle. Sarah remained silent, understanding that this wasn't a conversation she was expected to join. These officers were wrestling with the kind of decision that ended careers if it went wrong and saved lives if it went right. The mathematics of military leadership had always been unforgiving, but in this case, the equation was particularly stark. Major General Reynolds turned to the intelligence officer, who had been quietly monitoring communications from a corner workstation. Colonel Martinez, what's the latest from State Department? Colonel Martinez looked up from his secure terminal, his expression grim. The hostage situation has deteriorated further, ma'am. Our intelligence assets report that the execution timeline has been moved up. We now have less than 10 hours before the deadline. And diplomatic alternatives? Exhausted. The host government has rejected all prisoner exchange proposals, refused to consider monetary compensation, and indicated that they view this as an opportunity to demonstrate their independence from American influence. The room fell silent except for the low hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of aircraft operations continuing their normal rhythm outside. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat, steady but elevated, as she waited for the decision that would either validate 3 years of unconventional preparation or confirm her colleagues' assessment that she was unsuited for important missions. General Reynolds stood and walked to the weather display, studying the swirling patterns of electrical activity that blocked any conventional approach to the target area. Captain Mitchell, I need you to understand something. If I authorize this mission and you fail, 12 American civilians die. If I authorize this mission and you're killed in the attempt, I've lost a pilot and accomplished nothing. If I don't authorize this mission and pursue alternative options, those same 12 people die anyway, but I don't risk additional lives in the process. Yes, ma'am. I understand the parameters. Do you? Reynolds turned to face Sarah directly, her expression intense. Because from where I'm standing, the logical choice is to accept that some situations are beyond our ability to resolve militarily. Sometimes the responsible decision is to acknowledge limitations rather than attempt impossibilities. Sarah felt the familiar weight of institutional logic pressing down on her, the same force that had relegated her to training missions and equipment testing for the past 3 years. It was rational, measured, and completely at odds with everything she believed about the purpose of military aviation. General, Sarah said carefully. May I speak freely? Reynolds nodded. Go ahead, Captain. The reason this mission seems impossible is because we've become too dependent on technology to solve problems that require human judgment. Our aircraft are more sophisticated than ever, but our pilots have lost the ability to fly them when that sophistication becomes a liability. Lieutenant Colonel Foster looked up from her tablet, her expression skeptical. Captain, technology exists to enhance human capabilities, not replace them. The systems on a B-2 Spirit are designed to allow pilots to accomplish missions that would be impossible with manual controls alone. Under normal circumstances, Sarah agreed. But these aren't normal circumstances. The same technology that makes us superior in conventional conflicts becomes our greatest vulnerability when the battlefield changes. Colonel Harrison leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. Sarah, even if we accept your premise about technological dependence, that doesn't change the fundamental physics of what you're proposing. Manual flight control of an inherently unstable aircraft through extreme weather conditions, it's beyond human capabilities. It's beyond normal training, Sarah corrected, but not beyond human capabilities. Every system we use today was once considered impossible. Jet engines, stealth technology, precision-guided munitions, all of them represented leaps beyond what was previously thought achievable. Major General Reynolds returned to her seat, her expression thoughtful. Captain, you've clearly given this considerable thought. But thinking about something and executing it under life-or-death conditions are different challenges entirely. Sarah reached into her flight suit pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper, not her usual notebook, but something more formal. She placed it on the table and smoothed it carefully. This is a flight plan, she said. Complete navigation route, timing calculations, and contingency procedures for every phase of the mission. I've been working on it for the past 2 years. The statement hung in the air like a confession. Colonel Harrison picked up the paper and began studying it, his eyebrows rising as he took in the level of detail. The flight plan wasn't a hastily conceived response to the current crisis. It was a comprehensive document that addressed scenarios most pilots had never considered. 2 years? Lieutenant Colonel Foster asked. Captain, this specific mission didn't exist 2 years ago. This type of mission did, Sarah replied. Electromagnetic warfare, manual flight control, precision strikes in denied environments. The scenarios change, but the fundamental challenges remain constant. I've been preparing for the day when our technological advantages become disadvantages. General. Reynolds studied the flight plan over Harrison's shoulder, her expression shifting from skepticism to genuine interest. These calculations. Captain, where did you acquire this level of expertise in electromagnetic field theory? Main extension courses during my off-duty time. Correspondence study through the Air Force Institute of Technology. Private consultation with meteorologists and atmospheric physicists. Sarah's answer was matter-of-fact, without any hint of pride or defensiveness. While other pilots were maintaining currency in current systems, I was studying the physics that underlies all systems. Colonel Martinez looked up from his communication terminal again. General, I'm receiving updated intelligence on the target facility. The compound's defensive systems include surface-to-air missiles and radar-guided anti-aircraft artillery. Even with full stealth capabilities, penetration would be challenging. And without stealth capabilities? Reynolds asked. Effectively. Impossible using conventional approach vectors, Martinez admitted. However, He paused, studying his display more carefully. There appears to be a geographical feature that might provide natural radar masking. A deep valley approximately 12 miles from the target that could allow low-level approach. Sarah nodded. That's accounted for in the flight plan. Valley approach, terrain following at 200 feet. Weapons release from a pop-up maneuver. Designed to minimize exposure time. Harrison looked up from the flight plan, his expression a mixture of amazement and concern. Sarah, this document is incredibly detailed, but it's also completely untested. You're asking us to bet everything on theoretical calculations. All military operations start with theoretical calculations, Sarah replied. The difference is whether those calculations are based on experience with technology that might fail or experience with fundamentals that don't change. General Reynolds was quiet for a long moment, her eyes moving between the flight plan, the weather displays, and Sarah's composed expression. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of command decision. Captain Mitchell, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I need a direct answer. Setting aside everything we've discussed about preparation and theory and unconventional approaches to, you believe you can successfully complete this mission? Sarah met the general's gaze without hesitation. Yes, ma'am. And if you're wrong, then 12 Americans die anyway, ma'am. The only difference is whether we tried everything possible to save them. The room fell silent again, but this time the silence felt different. It carried the weight of a decision being made, of impossible being weighed against inevitable. General Reynolds stood up, her expression resolute. Captain Mitchell, you are hereby authorized to attempt the mission. Colonel Harrison will provide full logistical support. Lieutenant Colonel Foster will coordinate with maintenance on aircraft modifications. She paused, looking directly at Sarah. Captain, understand that this authorization comes with complete responsibility. If you succeed, you'll have saved 12 lives and proven that human skill can overcome technological limitations. If you fail, the consequences rest entirely on the decision you're making right now. Sarah straightened to full attention. I understand. MAAM. Then get to work. You have 6 hours until launch. Asterisk, as the meeting dispersed and officers hurried to coordinate the impossible mission, Sarah remained standing at attention for a moment longer. 3 years of preparation were about to be tested in the most unforgiving environment imaginable. The dismissal she'd faced that morning had transformed into reluctant acceptance, but acceptance nonetheless. Now came the part that couldn't be planned or calculated, turning theory into survival. Hangar 7 had been transformed into something resembling a high-tech surgical theater crossed with an emergency room. Work lights blazed at maximum intensity, casting harsh shadows across the B-2's angular surfaces as teams of specialists worked with the focused urgency of trauma surgeons. The normal quiet reverence of the stealth bomber facility had been replaced by the controlled chaos of the impossible being attempted in real time. Master Sergeant Vasquez moved beneath the aircraft's belly with the fluid precision of someone who had performed complex maintenance procedures thousands of times, but never quite like this. Her hands worked steadily to disconnect primary flight control cables while a team of avionics specialists carefully rerouted backup systems that hadn't been activated since the aircraft's initial testing phase 15 years earlier. Hydraulic pressure holding steady, called out Staff Sergeant Kevin Murphy from his position near the landing gear bay. Manual linkages are responding within acceptable parameters. Copy that, Vasquez replied without looking up from the control assembly. She was modifying. How are we looking on the stealth system lockdown? Technical Sergeant Lisa Chen emerged from beneath the starboard wing, her coveralls stained with the specialized compounds used to maintain the aircraft's radar-absorbing coating. Emergency configuration is locked in place. We've got about 60% effectiveness, maybe less if the electromagnetic interference affects the coating's molecular structure. Sarah stood at a portable workstation that had been wheeled into the hangar, studying real-time weather data streaming from multiple satellite feeds. The storm system showed no signs of diminishing. If anything, the electrical activity was intensifying as atmospheric pressure dropped and wind speeds increased. Lightning strikes were now occurring every 6 seconds instead of 8, creating an almost continuous electromagnetic field that would have been fascinating to study under different circumstances. Colonel Harrison approached from the hangar entrance, his expression carrying the controlled tension of someone managing multiple critical timelines simultaneously. Captain, I've just received confirmation from intelligence. The target compound's defensive systems are fully operational, and they've increased patrols around the facility. They know something's coming. Sarah looked up from the weather display, her mind automatically calculating how increased security would affect approach vectors and extraction timing. Do we have updated imagery of the defensive positions? Uploading to your mission computer now, Harrison replied, gesturing toward the tablet mounted near her workstation. Sarah, I need to ask, are you absolutely certain about the approach route? Intelligence is expressing concerns about the valley corridor you've selected. The valley approach was the cornerstone of Sarah's mission plan, a geographical feature that would provide natural radar masking during the final approach to the target. The route required precision flying at extremely low altitude, threading between canyon walls while maintaining enough speed to avoid being caught by pursuing aircraft. The valley is our only option for avoiding surface-to-air missiles, Sarah explained, pulling up a three-dimensional terrain map on her tablet. The compound sits on elevated ground with clear sight lines in every direction except through this canyon system. It's narrow, but it's navigable. In good weather, Harrison pointed out, you'll be flying through the edge of that storm system. Visibility will be near zero, and wind shear in the canyon could be severe enough to slam you into the walls. Sarah nodded, understanding the colonel's concerns while remaining confident in her calculations. The storm's wind patterns actually work in our favor. The electrical activity creates predictable downdrafts that I can use for additional concealment. The key is timing the approach to coincide with the electromagnetic pulses. From beneath the aircraft, Sergeant Vasquez called out an update. Manual control linkages are installed and tested. We're ready to run the full system check. Sarah walked over to the aircraft and climbed the access ladder to the cockpit, settling into the pilot's seat that had been modified with additional manual instruments borrowed from older aircraft. The familiar environment of the B-2's cabin felt different now, stripped of its technological sophistication and returned to the fundamental relationship between pilot and machine that had defined aviation for its first 50 years. Initiating manual control test, Sarah announced over the intercom system. She placed her hands on the control stick, feeling the direct mechanical connection to the aircraft's flight surfaces for the first time. The sensation was both alien and familiar. Alien because modern pilots rarely experienced unmediated control of their aircraft. Familiar because it connected her to every pilot who had ever flown by instinct and skill rather than computer assistance. She moved the stick gently to the left. On the ground, observers could see the aircraft's wing surfaces respond immediately, the control flaps adjusting with the kind of direct precision that computer-mediated systems couldn't quite replicate. The response felt different, more immediate, but less predictable, requiring constant attention and adjustment rather than the set-and-forget convenience of automated flight controls. Control response is good, Vasquez reported. All manual systems are functioning within normal parameters. Sarah spent the next 20 minutes working through every control input, familiarizing herself with the aircraft's manual handling characteristics. The B-2 felt exactly as unstable as everyone had warned, like trying to balance on a knife's edge while riding a bicycle across a tightrope. Every input required immediate correction, and every correction created new instabilities that demanded additional attention. But gradually, a rhythm emerged. Sarah began to anticipate the aircraft's responses, feeling the subtle changes in aerodynamic pressure that preceded control difficulties. Her hands developed the kind of constant micro-adjustments that vintage aircraft pilots had mastered through necessity, treating the control stick not as a steering wheel, but as a conversation with physics itself. How does it feel? Colonel Harrison asked over the intercom. Like flying a $60 billion sailplane in a hurricane, Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the concentration required to maintain control. Challenging, but manageable. Lieutenant Colonel Foster's voice crackled through the radio. From the command center, Captain Mitchell, we're receiving updated timeline information. The hostage execution has been moved up again. You now have 4 hours and 37 minutes until deadline. Sarah felt her stomach tighten, but her hands remained steady on the controls. The shortened timeline meant less preparation time, but also less time for second-guessing and institutional resistance to build. Sometimes urgency was an advantage, It prevented overthinking and forced focus on execution rather than planning. "Copy that," she acknowledged. "How much longer for final preparations?" Sergeant Vasquez consulted her checklist. "Weapons loading is next, then final systems checks. We'll be ready for departure in 90 minutes. The weapons loading process for this mission was unlike anything the maintenance crews had performed before. Instead of the precision-guided munitions that typically filled the B-2's weapons bay, they were installing older gravity bombs with mechanical timing systems, weapons that relied on pilot skill and timing rather than computer guidance for accuracy. Staff. Sergeant Murphy supervised the loading process with the careful attention of someone handling explosives that would soon be dropped from an unstable aircraft flying through extreme weather conditions. "These bombs haven't been used operationally since the Gulf War," he commented to his team. "Everything's mechanical, no GPS guidance, no terrain following systems, just physics and timing." "Which is exactly what we need," Sarah replied from the cockpit. "Computer-guided weapons won't function in that electromagnetic environment anyway. At least with gravity bombs, we know they'll work regardless of what the storm does to our electronics." The next hour passed in a blur of final preparations, system checks, and last-minute adjustments. Sarah reviewed her flight plan repeatedly, memorizing waypoints and timing calculations that would need to be executed without electronic assistance. The route was burned into her memory like a musical score, every turn, every altitude change, every critical decision point cataloged and rehearsed. As the maintenance teams completed their work and began clearing the hangar for departure, Sarah remained in the cockpit, running through mental rehearsals of the most challenging phases of the mission. The storm penetration would require split-second timing to take advantage of electromagnetic interference gaps. The valley approach would demand precision flying at minimum altitude. The weapons release would need to be calculated by eye and instinct rather than computer targeting. Colonel Harrison climbed up to the cockpit for a final briefing. "Sarah, I want you to understand something. This mission has been classified at the highest levels. If you succeed, it will probably never be officially acknowledged. If you fail, it will definitely never be officially acknowledged. Either way, you're flying into history." Sarah looked at him with an expression of calm determination. "Colonel, I didn't volunteer for recognition. I volunteered because 12 Americans are going to die if someone doesn't try something impossible." "And you believe you're that someone?" "I believe I'm the only one who's been preparing for this specific type of impossible," Sarah replied. "Whether that's enough, we'll find out in about 3 hours." As Harrison climbed down from the aircraft and the hangar doors began opening to reveal the storm-darkened sky beyond, Sarah performed one final check of her instruments. The manual controls responded smoothly, the weapons system showed ready status, and the fuel tanks were topped off for maximum range. Outside, lightning illuminated the clouds in stroboscopic flashes, and thunder rolled across the base with the persistence of artillery bombardment. Somewhere beyond that wall of electrical fury, 12 Americans were counting on solutions that existed only in the mind of a pilot who had spent 3 years learning to fly without the technology that defined modern aviation. Sarah started the engines, feeling the familiar vibration of massive turbofans spinning up to operational speed. The aircraft was ready. The mission was planned. The only question that remained was whether 3 years of unconventional preparation would be enough to turn impossible into inevitable. "Ghost Rider ready for departure," she announced over the radio. "Copy, Ghost Rider," came the reply from the control tower. "You are cleared for takeoff when ready. Good luck, Captain." Sarah taxied toward the runway, the manual controls requiring constant attention, even during ground operations. Behind her, the hangar team watched in silence as their impossible creation moved toward its moment of truth. The storm waited ahead, and beyond it, 12 lives hung in the balance. The runway at Whiteman Air Force Base stretched ahead like a ribbon of concrete, disappearing into darkness. Sarah advanced the throttle steadily, feeling the B-2's massive engines respond with the deep rumble that preceded takeoff. Unlike her, countless previous departures in this aircraft, every control input now demanded her complete attention. The fly-by-wire systems that normally made takeoff a routine procedure had been replaced by the unforgiving reality of manual flight control. At 140 knots, she pulled back gently on the stick. The aircraft lifted off with the grace of a technological marvel, but Sarah could feel the constant instabilities that the computers had previously masked. Small corrections, continuous adjustments, the kind of hands-on flying that required absolute concentration even during the most basic maneuvers. "Ghost Rider airborne," she announced into her headset, though she knew that radio communication would soon become impossible as she approached the storm's electromagnetic field. "Copy, Ghost Rider," came the reply from Whiteman's control tower. "You are cleared to proceed on course. Weather update indicates storm intensity continuing to increase. Lightning frequency now every 4 seconds. Sarah acknowledged the transmission while mentally adjusting her timing calculations. The electromagnetic windows she'd planned to exploit for navigation fixes were becoming narrower with each passing minute. What had been an 8-second gap between lightning strikes was now 4 seconds, barely enough time for a quick compass reading before the next electromagnetic pulse scrambled every electronic system on the aircraft. At 15,000 feet, she leveled off and began her approach to the storm front. From this distance, the electrical activity looked like a massive wall of flickering light stretching from the Earth's surface to the edge of space. Lightning branched through the clouds in patterns that resembled the neural networks of some vast atmospheric brain, beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. Her last radio transmission from Whiteman came through with increasing static. "Ghost Rider, you are approaching the electromagnetic interference zone. From this point forward, you'll be operating under complete communication blackout. Mission Control will monitor your progress via satellite when possible, but assume you're entirely on your own until mission completion." "Understood," Sarah replied, knowing these would be her last words to the outside world until she either completed the mission or died in the attempt. She switched off the radio and began the systematic shutdown of every electronic system that wasn't essential for basic flight operation. The GPS display flickered and died as the first electromagnetic pulse hit the aircraft. The navigation computer followed seconds later, its screen going dark with the finality of expensive equipment being destroyed by forces beyond its design parameters. One by one, the sophisticated systems that made the B-2 Spirit the world's most advanced bomber were reduced to useless. Weight by the same storm that would provide cover for her approach, Sarah consulted the compass mounted directly in front of her, a mechanical instrument borrowed from a 1960s-era aircraft and installed specifically for this mission. The needle pointed steadily northeast, toward a destination she would have to find using techniques that predated satellite navigation by decades. The storm's edge hit her like a physical force. Turbulence slammed the aircraft sideways with enough violence to test the structural limits of the airframe. Sarah fought the controls, using every muscle in her arms and shoulders to maintain level flight as wind shear tried to flip the inherently unstable bomber onto its back. Lightning struck, somewhere close enough to illuminate the cockpit in stark relief, the electromagnetic pulse racing through the aircraft systems like electronic poison. Her backup navigation display flickered and died. The fuel quantity indicators went dark. One by one, the electronic systems she'd hoped might survive the storm succumbed to electrical interference that overwhelmed every circuit board on the aircraft, but the manual controls continued to respond. The mechanical compass held steady. The backup altimeter, driven by simple air pressure rather than electronic sensors, continued to provide accurate altitude information. Stripped of its technological sophistication, The B-2 Spirit was being reduced to its most fundamental elements: aluminum, steel, and the skill of the pilot flying it. Sarah pulled out her handwritten flight plan, secured to her thigh with Velcro straps to prevent it from being lost in the turbulent conditions. The timing calculations she'd spent months perfecting now became critical for survival. Every waypoint, every course correction, every altitude change had to be executed based on elapsed time and dead reckoning navigation. 15 minutes into the storm, she encountered the first gap in the electromagnetic interference, a brief window where the lightning activity paused, just long enough for her to attempt a position fix using the aircraft's backup radio beacon receiver. She turned the frequency dial carefully, listening through her headset for the faint signal from a navigation station 200 miles to the south, there a weak but identifiable tone that allowed her to calculate her position relative to the known. Transmitter. She was 3 miles north of her planned course, pushed off track by wind currents that behaved differently inside the storm than weather models had predicted. Sarah made a gentle course correction, bringing the aircraft back toward the route that would take her to the target area. The correction required extraordinary delicacy. In normal conditions, such a minor navigational adjustment would be handled automatically by the flight management computer. Now, with manual controls in severe turbulence, every input risked triggering a loss of control that could send the aircraft into an unrecoverable spin. Another lightning strike, closer this time, illuminated the interior of the storm in fantastic detail. Sarah found herself flying through clouds that resembled cathedral architecture built from water vapor and electrical energy. The beauty was breathtaking and deadly. Each flash revealed wind patterns that could tear an aircraft apart if approached incorrectly. She consulted her altimeter and realized she was descending faster than planned. The storm's downdrafts were more powerful than her calculations had accounted for, pulling the aircraft toward the earth with relentless force. Sarah added power and pulled back slightly on the controls, fighting to maintain the altitude that would keep her above the mountains ahead. The fuel consumption was higher than expected as well. Fighting the storm's turbulence required constant throttle adjustments and power changes that burned fuel at nearly twice the normal rate. Sarah ran quick mental calculations and realized she was approaching the point where she would have barely enough fuel to complete the mission and return to base. Assuming everything went perfectly from this point forward, nothing about this mission was going to go perfectly. 30 minutes into the storm penetration, Sarah encountered a phenomenon she had read about but never experienced: St. Elmo's fire. Blue-white electrical discharges danced across the aircraft's exterior surfaces, creating an ethereal glow that outlined the B-2's wings in ghostly light. The effect was mesmerizing, but she forced herself to ignore the display and focus on the instruments that still functioned. The storm was beginning to thin slightly, though lightning continued to illuminate the clouds around her with stroboscopic intensity. According to her calculations, she should be approaching the far edge of the electromagnetic interference zone within the next 10 minutes. If her navigation was accurate, she would emerge from the storm approximately 50 miles from the target area, with just enough time to begin her low-level approach to the compound. If her navigation was wrong, she could emerge anywhere within a 100-mile radius, potentially over hostile territory with insufficient fuel to reach the target or return home. Sarah checked her mechanical wristwatch, a backup timepiece she wore specifically for missions where electronic chronometers might fail. 43 minutes since entering the storm. According to her flight plan, she should begin descending toward the valley approach route in 12 minutes. Regardless of visibility conditions. Another electromagnetic pulse raced through the aircraft's systems, but this time Sarah noticed something different. The intensity was diminishing. The intervals between lightning strikes were becoming slightly longer. The storm was either weakening or she was approaching its edge. Both possibilities that suggested her navigation had been more accurate than she'd dared hope. She began a gradual descent, trading altitude for the lower profile that would be essential for avoiding detection during the final approach. The manual controls required constant attention as changing air pressure and wind conditions affected the aircraft's stability. Every 1,000 feet of descent brought new challenges, new instabilities that had to be corrected by hand. At 8,000 feet, the storm finally began to release its grip on the aircraft. Lightning strikes became intermittent rather than continuous. Some of her electronic systems attempted to restart, their displays flickering briefly before failing again. But the electromagnetic interference was weak enough now that her backup radio receiver could pick up navigation signals from multiple stations. Sarah triangulated her position using the intersecting signals and felt a surge of satisfaction. She was less than 5 miles from her planned course, well within acceptable parameters for the precision required in the next phase of the mission. The storm had tested every aspect of her preparation, but the fundamentals had held. Ahead, she could see the first hints of clear sky stars visible through gaps in the clouds, the promise of flying conditions that would allow visual navigation for the final approach. But clear skies also meant exposure to enemy radar, the loss of the electromagnetic cover that had hidden her, penetration of hostile airspace. Sarah switched the stealth systems to their emergency configuration, knowing that the 60% effectiveness Sergeant Vasquez had promised would have to be enough. She was committed now, flying toward a target defended by surface-to-air missiles and anti-aircraft artillery, in an aircraft that would show up on enemy radar scopes like a conventional bomber, the valley that would provide her final approach. Route appeared on the horizon, a dark slash cutting through mountainous terrain that rose to over 9,000 feet on either side. The approach would require her to descend to 200 feet above the valley floor, threading between canyon walls in an aircraft designed for high-altitude strategic bombing. Sarah began her descent toward the valley entrance, knowing that the next 20 minutes would determine whether 3 years of preparation had been enough to turn impossible into inevitable. Behind her, the storm continued its electrical display, lightning illuminating the clouds she had somehow managed to survive. Ahead lay the most dangerous part of a mission that had redefined the meaning of dangerous. The valley entrance loomed ahead like the mouth of a stone cathedral, its walls rising sharply from the desert floor to form a natural corridor that cut through the mountainous terrain. Sarah descended toward the opening at a steep angle, trading altitude for the low profile that would keep her below enemy radar coverage. At 500 feet above ground level, the B-2's massive wingspan seemed impossibly large for the narrow passage she was about to enter. The aircraft's radar warning receiver had been damaged by electromagnetic pulses during the storm penetration, leaving Sarah blind to enemy tracking attempts. She had to assume that hostile forces were actively searching for her aircraft, using every available sensor to detect the infiltration they knew was coming. The valley approach was her only option for avoiding surface-to-air missiles, but it came with risks that conventional military doctrine would have deemed unacceptable. Sarah checked her mechanical altimeter and airspeed indicator, the only instruments still functioning with complete reliability. 200 feet above the valley floor, speed holding steady at 320 knots, fast enough to maintain control of the inherently unstable airframe, slow enough to navigate the turns and elevation changes ahead. The margin for error was measured in seconds and feet, with no room for miscalculation. The first bend in the valley appeared ahead, a sharp turn to the left that would require precise timing and control inputs. Sarah began the turn early, banking the aircraft gently while fighting the cross winds that funneled through the mountain corridor. The B-2's fly-by-wire systems would have calculated the optimal turn radius automatically, adjusting control surfaces thousands of times per second to maintain smooth flight. Now every correction came from her hands alone. The valley walls flashed past on either side, close enough that she could see individual rock formations and the sparse vegetation that clung to the mountainsides. Flying at this altitude and mountainous terrain violated every safety protocol in military aviation, but it was the only way to reach the target without being detected by the sophisticated air defense network that protected the compound. 3 minutes into the valley run, Sarah encountered the first major obstacle, a narrowing in the corridor where ancient geological forces had squeezed the passage to barely 400 feet wide. With the B-2's 172-foot wingspan, she had less than 120 feet of clearance on each side. At 320 knots, there was no time for hesitation or course corrections. She lined up the aircraft with the center of the gap, using visual references on the valley floor to maintain precise lateral positioning. The walls seemed to blur past in her peripheral vision as she focused entirely on the narrow band of sky ahead. For 15 seconds that felt like hours, the B-2 threaded through the geological needle, its wingtips passing within 50 feet of solid rock. Clear of the narrows, Sarah allowed herself one quick glance at her fuel gauge. The constant maneuvering and power adjustments required for low-level flight were consuming fuel even faster than her worst-case projections. She was approaching the point where she would have barely enough fuel to reach the target and attempt the return journey. There would be no margin for extended combat maneuvering or route deviations. The valley began to widen as she approached the target area, but Sarah knew this apparent relief was deceptive. Intelligence reports indicated that the compound's defenders had positioned observation posts on the high ground surrounding the valley exit. The moment she emerged from the mountain corridor, she would be visible to enemy spotters who could direct surface-to-air missiles and anti-aircraft artillery fire. Her tactical display had been destroyed by electromagnetic interference during the storm penetration, leaving her without real-time information about enemy positions or defensive systems. She was flying toward a heavily defended target with no electronic warfare support, no missile warning systems, and no way to jam enemy radar tracking. The stealth characteristics that remained after the system lockdown would provide some protection, but not enough to guarantee survival. Sarah consulted her wristwatch and the handwritten mission timeline strapped to her thigh. According to her calculations, she was less than 2 minutes from the initial point where she would begin the bombing run. The compound should be visible ahead, a collection of buildings constructed on elevated ground that provided commanding views of the surrounding terrain. She began a gradual climb, gaining the altitude necessary for the pop-up attack maneuver that would allow her to deliver the gravity bombs with sufficient accuracy. The ancient weapons in her bomb bay relied on ballistic calculations that had been used since the Second World War. Trajectory, wind speed, target motion, and the immutable laws of physics that govern falling objects. The compound appeared exactly where her navigation calculations had predicted, a cluster of concrete structures surrounded by defensive positions that bristled with anti-aircraft weapons. Sarah could see vehicle movement around the facility's perimeter, evidence that her approach had been detected despite the valley's radar masking. The element of surprise was gone, replaced by the stark reality of flying into prepared defenses. At 1,500 feet above ground level, she began the bombing run. The pop-up maneuver required her to climb sharply while maintaining precise heading toward the target, exposing the aircraft to defensive fire while setting up for weapons release. Sarah pulled back on the stick, feeling the B-2 respond with the sluggish grace of an aircraft operating at the edge of its performance envelope. Surface to air missiles began launching from positions around the compound, their exhaust trails visible as bright streaks climbing toward her altitude. Without electronic countermeasures or defensive systems, Sarah's only protection was the pilot's oldest defensive technique, maneuvering to avoid incoming threats while maintaining the attack heading necessary for accurate bombing. She rolled the aircraft left as the first missile approached, then right to avoid a second launch from a different position. The manual flight controls made evasive maneuvering exhausting, requiring physical strength that pulled at her arms and shoulders with each violent course change. But the same instability that made the B-2 difficult to fly manually also made it highly maneuverable when piloted by someone willing to exploit its aerodynamic characteristics. The target grew larger in her windscreen as she approached the release point calculated by eye and timing rather than computer assistance. Sarah activated the mechanical bomb release system, feeling the aircraft jolt slightly as 2,000 pounds of explosives separated from the weapons bay and began their ballistic journey toward the compound below. She didn't wait to observe the impact. The moment the bombs were away, Sarah threw the aircraft into a sharp diving turn that would take her back toward the valley entrance at maximum speed. Anti-aircraft artillery filled the air around her with tracer fire and explosive shells, creating a deadly fireworks display that lit up the night sky. A surface-to-air missile detonated close enough to shake the aircraft violently, its fragmentation pattern peppering the B-2's left wing with small holes that disrupted the smooth airflow across the control surfaces. Sarah felt the change immediately increased vibration, altered control responses, the kind of battle damage that could make an already difficult aircraft impossible to fly. She reached the valley entrance as explosions erupted behind her, the gravity bombs finding their targets with the accuracy that came from precise calculation and perfect timing. The compound's main building disappeared in a fireball that illuminated the mountainsides for miles in every direction, followed by secondary explosions that suggested the destruction of ammunition storage areas. But Sarah's attention was focused entirely on flying the damaged aircraft back through the narrow mountain corridor that had nearly killed her on the inbound journey. The B-2's handling characteristics had changed dramatically. Control inputs that had worked perfectly during the approach now produced unpredictable responses. The aircraft wanted to roll left constantly, requiring continuous right stick pressure to maintain level flight. The first turn in the valley required twice the effort it had on the inbound leg. Sarah fought the controls with both hands, using every ounce of strength to keep the bomber centered in the narrow passage. The battle damage had upset the aircraft's already marginal stability, creating a flying machine that demanded absolute perfection from its pilot just to remain airborne. Halfway through the valley, she encountered severe turbulence caused by wind patterns disrupted by the explosions behind her. The damaged aircraft bucked and rolled in the mountain corridor, its wounded flight characteristics making each wind gust a potential catastrophe. Sarah rode the turbulence like a sailor in a storm, feeling for the aircraft's rhythm and working with its instabilities rather than fighting them. The narrow section that had challenged her on the inbound journey now seemed impossible. Flying a damaged, unstable aircraft through a 400-foot wide gap at 300 knots required skills that existed at the very edge of human capability. Sarah lined up for the passage, knowing that one small error would spread wreckage across a mile of mountain terrain. The walls flashed past again, but this time the aircraft's unpredictable handling made the experience terrifying rather than merely dangerous. A sudden gust tried to roll the bomber inverted just as she entered the narrowest part of the passage. Sarah hauled back on the stick, fighting to keep the wings level as rock formations passed within arm's reach of the aircraft's extremities. Clear of the narrows, she allowed herself a moment to assess the damage. The left wing showed multiple punctures from missile fragments, and fuel was streaming from at least one ruptured tank. The aircraft was becoming lighter as fuel leaked away, changing its balance and handling characteristics with each passing minute. Sarah calculated quickly in her head. With the fuel loss from battle damage, she was well below the minimum required for a safe return to base. She could attempt to reach a closer airfield, but most of the surrounding territory was hostile. She could try to stretch the remaining fuel by reducing power and optimizing her flight profile. But the damaged aircraft's increased drag would make such conservation measures less effective, or she could attempt something that no pilot had ever tried before: flying a battle-damaged B-2 Spirit through an electromagnetic storm using manual controls alone. Behind her, the compound burned in a pillar of fire visible for 50 miles. Ahead, the storm system still raged with undiminished fury, its lightning displays promising a return journey that would make the outbound flight seem like a training exercise. Sarah checked her fuel gauge one more time, then began climbing toward the storm wall that separated her from home. The mission was complete, but survival remained an open question. The storm wall rose before Sarah like a living thing, its electrical displays more violent than during her outbound journey. Lightning struck continuously now, creating an electromagnetic field so intense that her remaining functional instruments flickered and died as she approached the outer edge of the interference zone. The battle-damaged B-2 shuddered with each atmospheric disturbance, its compromised flight characteristics making every wind gust a test of survival. Sarah pulled out her mechanical compass and secured it where she could see it clearly. This simple instrument, unaffected by electromagnetic interference, would be her only reliable navigation aid for the return journey, through conditions that had already pushed her skills beyond anything she'd trained for. The aircraft's fuel situation was critical. Streaming vapor from the damaged left wing told her that every minute of flight time was borrowed against the inevitable. She began her penetration of the storm at 12,000 feet, immediately encountering turbulence that felt more violent than during the outbound transit. The damaged aircraft responded unpredictably to each wind shear, requiring constant control inputs that exhausted her arms and shoulders. What had been challenging in an undamaged aircraft was becoming nearly impossible with battle damage affecting every aspect of the B-2's handling. The first lightning strike hit close enough to illuminate the cockpit in stark white light, the electromagnetic pulse racing through the aircraft's systems like electronic wildfire. Her backup altimeter flickered and died, leaving her without reliable altitude information in conditions where 1,000-foot error could drive her into the ground. Sarah was forced to fly by feel, using the aircraft's response to atmospheric pressure changes to estimate her altitude above the unseen terrain below. 15 minutes into the storm penetration, the fuel situation became critical. The gauge that had shown minimal but adequate reserves now indicated levels below emergency minimum. Sarah calculated rapidly. At current consumption rates, she had perhaps 30 minutes of flight time remaining. The storm extended for at least 40 minutes of flying time under normal conditions, and these were anything but normal conditions. She reduced power to minimum levels consistent with maintaining control, trading airspeed for fuel conservation in a delicate balance that could kill her if miscalculated. The slower speed made the aircraft even more difficult to control in turbulence, but it was the only way to extend her range enough to have any chance of reaching friendly territory. A massive downdraft caught the bomber and drove it toward the earth with the force of a giant hand pressing down. Sarah fought the controls desperately, adding power she couldn't afford to lose while pulling back on the stick to arrest the descent. The altimeter was dead, but she could feel the increasing air pressure that indicated dangerously low altitude. She was flying blind through a three-dimensional maze where the wrong move meant instant death. Elmo's fire danced across the aircraft's surfaces again, but this time the electrical display illuminated the extent of battle damage more clearly. The left wing showed multiple punctures, some large enough to disrupt airflow patterns across the control surfaces. Fuel continued to stream from the damaged tanks, visible as a vapor trail that glowed eerily in the electrical discharges surrounding the aircraft. Halfway through the storm, Sarah encountered a phenomenon she hadn't experienced on the outbound journey: vertical wind shear so severe that it felt like the atmosphere was trying to tear the aircraft apart. The damaged B-2 bucked and rolled violently, its wounded flight characteristics amplifying every atmospheric disturbance into a crisis, requiring split-second responses. She fought to maintain control as the aircraft was thrown first up, then down, then sideways with forces that pushed the airframe to its structural limits. A less experienced pilot would have lost control immediately. Even with her extensive manual flying experience, Sarah found herself operating at the very edge of human capability, making corrections faster than conscious thought while trusting entirely in reflexes developed through thousands of hours of unconventional training. The fuel gauge now showed levels so low that normal procedures would have called for an immediate emergency landing. But there was nowhere to land except in hostile territory or in the middle of the storm itself. Sarah pressed on, knowing that the only choices were to reach friendly airspace or die in the attempt. Another lightning strike, this one close enough that she could smell ozone in the cockpit air. The electromagnetic pulse destroyed her backup radio equipment, leaving her with no way to communicate her position or status to anyone who might be tracking her progress. She was completely alone in the center of an atmospheric maelstrom, flying a crippled aircraft on fumes toward a destination she could only hope to find. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, the storm began to show signs of weakening. Lightning strikes became slightly less frequent. The electromagnetic interference that had rendered her instruments useless started to diminish enough that her compass needle began holding steady again. Sarah felt a surge of hope tempered by the knowledge that her fuel situation was becoming desperate. At what she estimated to be 20 minutes from the storm's edge, the fuel flow warning light illuminated on her instrument panel, the one electronic system that had somehow survived the electromagnetic assault. The warning indicated that she had less than 10 minutes of flight time remaining at current consumption rates. Sarah made a decision that violated every principle of safe flying. She reduced power even further, bringing the aircraft to the minimum speed at which she could maintain control. The margin between controlled flight and aerodynamic stall became razor thin, but it was the only way to stretch her remaining fuel far enough to clear the storm, flying at minimum speed in severe turbulence. With a damaged aircraft required skills that existed at the intersection of art and science. Sarah rode the wind currents like a sailplane pilot, using updrafts to gain altitude and downdrafts for speed, conserving every possible joule of energy to extend her range. The aircraft responded sluggishly to control inputs, balanced on the knife edge between flight and falling. The storm's edge appeared ahead as a gradual lightening of the darkness, stars becoming visible through gaps in the clouds that had hidden them for the past hour. Sarah's mechanical watch showed that she had been in the storm for 57 minutes, longer than anyone had thought possible for an aircraft to survive in such conditions. But survival wasn't assured yet. The fuel gauge now showed empty, though she knew that aircraft fuel systems held reserves below the empty indication. How much reserve and whether it would be enough to reach Whiteman Air Force Base remained unknown. Clear of the storm, Sarah attempted to restart some of her navigation equipment. The GPS system remained dead, destroyed by electromagnetic pulses during the storm transit. But her VHF radio crackled to life, its antenna apparently having survived the electrical assault. "Mayday, mayday. This is Ghost Rider requesting immediate vectors to Whiteman," she transmitted, her voice steady despite the exhaustion that was beginning to affect her physical coordination. The response came immediately. "Ghost Rider, this is Whiteman Approach Control. We've been tracking you on radar since you cleared the storm. Vector heading 285, distance 43 miles. Emergency equipment is standing by." 43 miles. Sarah calculated quickly and realized she was flying on borrowed time. At minimum power settings, she might have enough fuel to cover 30 miles, maybe 35 if atmospheric conditions remained favorable. She would fall short of the runway by nearly 10 miles. "Whiteman Approach, Ghost Rider is declaring fuel emergency. I estimate flameout in approximately 12 minutes. Copy, Ghost Rider. We're clearing all traffic and lighting the runway. Can you maintain current heading and altitude? Sarah looked at her fuel gauge, which now showed readings below the empty mark. The engines were running on fumes and whatever reserves remained in fuel lines and pumps. Affirmative on heading. Altitude will be descending due to power reduction for maximum range. What followed was a flight profile that pushed the boundaries of aerodynamic possibility. Sarah descended gradually while reducing power even further, trading altitude for distance in a glide pattern that extracted every possible mile from the aircraft's remaining energy. The damaged B-2 flew like a wounded bird, its battle scars affecting lift and drag in ways that required constant compensation. At 20 miles from the base, the left engine flamed out. The sudden asymmetric thrust tried to yaw the aircraft off course, but Sarah corrected immediately with rudder inputs that kept the bomber tracking toward the runway. Single-engine flight in a B-2 was challenging under normal circumstances. With battle damage and manual flight controls, it required absolute precision. At 10 miles from the runway, the right engine began showing signs of impending fuel starvation. Sarah could feel the power fluctuations as the engine sucked air from nearly empty fuel lines. She had perhaps 3 minutes of thrust remaining, enough to reach the runway environment, but not enough to execute a normal landing pattern. Ghost Rider, you're cleared for straight and approach runway 36. Emergency equipment in position. Sarah could see the runway lights ahead, a welcome sight after nearly 4 hours of flying through conditions that had tested every aspect of her training and preparation. But the approach would require one final demonstration of the skills that had made this mission possible. The right engine flamed out as she crossed the runway threshold. The B-2 became a glider, its aerodynamic characteristics altered by battle damage and the absence of engine thrust. Sarah flared for landing using only the aircraft's remaining momentum and the ground effect that provided a cushion of air beneath the wings. The main landing gear touched down with the gentlest impact she had ever achieved, the aircraft settling onto the runway like a bird returning to its nest. She deployed the drag chute and applied wheel brakes, bringing the massive bomber to a stop in the middle of the runway. She had departed from 6 hours earlier. Emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft immediately, but Sarah sat in the cockpit for a moment longer, her hands still gripping the controls that had carried her through the impossible. Through her headset, she could hear voices coordinating the emergency response, but the words seemed distant and unimportant. Ghost Rider, this is Whiteman Tower. Mission status report requested. Sarah keyed her microphone for what she knew would be her final transmission of the mission. Whiteman Tower, Ghost Rider. Mission accomplished. 12 American civilians are coming home. As she shut down the aircraft's systems and prepared to leave the cockpit, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 3 years of preparation, countless hours of studying techniques that others considered obsolete, and the quiet determination to be ready for the day when impossible became necessary. They had called her dead weight, unsuited for important missions, a relic from an earlier era of aviation. But when technology failed and conventional wisdom offered no solutions, it was the old skills, the fundamental abilities that existed before computers and automation, that had made the difference between life and death. The hangar doors opened as ground crews towed the battle-damaged bomber inside. Sarah climbed down from the cockpit to find Colonel Harrison waiting, his expression a mixture of relief, amazement, and something approaching awe. "Sarah," he said quietly, "how did you know you could do it?" She looked back at the aircraft that had carried her through the storm and into legend, its scarred wings and punctured surfaces, telling the story of a mission that would never appear in official records, but would be whispered about in pilot-ready rooms for generations. "I didn't." "No," she replied simply. "I just knew I was ready." In the end, that had been enough. The impossible had become inevitable, not through technology or institutional support, but through the quiet preparation of someone who understood that being ready mattered more than being recognized. The dead weight had flown the dragon through fire and brought everyone home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.